That face is yours, and something smaller than your fingernail just sentenced you to death. You are waist deep in a warm reed marsh at dusk, slapping your arm where something bit you, already watching it fly away. You don't feel sick yet, not even close. But deep in your blood, a count has already begun that your body cannot win. Tusk, curious, wide-eyed, always poking at things he probably shouldn't, is crouched on the bank right now, squinting at the water's surface like it owes him an answer. Neither of you knows the name of what just landed on you. Neither of you knows it has been hunting humans for perhaps 2 million years. Not lions, not drought, not war, not famine. Something with 6 legs and no malice whatsoever. So here is the question. Which single animal killed more of us than any predator, weapon, or starving season? And why did we never once think to call it the enemy? Because the answer doesn't just name a killer. It completely rewrites where the first great civilizations dared to plant their roots, and why so many of them simply didn't make it. What if the deadliest predator in human history was so small you could inhale it, and you lived next to it your whole life without ever knowing it was killing you? Here's the obvious objection. Surely ancient people noticed that mosquito bites and fevers arrive together, season after season, in the same swampy places. They weren't stupid. They watched the sky, mapped the stars, and built aqueducts that still carry water today. So why didn't they connect the dots sooner? Because cryptic predation doesn't work that way. The whole mechanism depends on the killer being invisible inside a longer chain of cause and effect, like blaming the mail carrier for every bill that arrives. Medieval Italian physicians were careful, learned people, and they got it completely, spectacularly wrong. They named the disease malaria from malaria, bad air, because the swamps where people fell sick did, in fact, smell appalling. The air near the Pontine marshes outside Rome was thick, warm, and foul, and everyone who camped there long enough got sick and often died. The smell seemed like the obvious culprit. It wasn't. Here is the brutal irony of cryptic predation. The mosquito was so small, so ordinary, so constant a background noise of summer life that it functionally disappeared from suspicion. Your brain is wired by a few million years of evolution to track teeth, claws, and things roughly your own size trying to eat you. A whining insect smaller than your thumbnail does not trigger that ancient alarm. It just itches. So the real killer fed on entire populations for centuries while physicians argued about vapor quality. The Romans drained some marshes, which helped, without ever understanding why it helped. A lucky answer arrived at by completely wrong reasoning, which is honestly a more common feature of medical history than anyone likes to admit. This is what makes cryptic predation so devastating as a mechanism. The feedback loop between cause and death is long enough and clouded enough by other variables that pattern recognition fails you. You need a microscope, a germ theory, and Ronald Ross working in Secunderabad in 1897 to finally close the loop and see the parasite moving through the mosquito's gut wall. That took until the late 19th century. The disease had been running the table on human civilization for far, far longer. Humans are wired to fear the thing with teeth. We have a fatal blind spot for the thing too small to see, and that blind spot cost us more than we have yet fully counted. But before we could even name the enemy, it had already been hunting us for longer than civilization itself. How long exactly? You are standing at the edge of a forest in eastern Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago, breathing in warm air, feeling like the newest, sharpest thing on the planet. You are not. 30 million years before your first ancestor stood upright, a mosquito was already doing exactly what it does today. Hovering, landing, drinking, leaving. It didn't need to adapt to you, it just waited. This is the deep time ambush, and it is the most quietly devastating fact in the entire history of disease. Fossil Anopheles mosquitoes preserved in amber from roughly 30 million years ago show the genus existed tens of millions of years before Homo sapiens, which means the vector that carries malaria was already an established, optimized, field-tested machine long before we gave it anything worth biting. The mosquito had already worked through dinosaurs. It had survived mass extinctions that erased 3/4 of life on Earth. By the time your species arrived in Africa, the Anopheles line had been running its route for longer than primates had even existed as a group. We walked in and handed it a new customer. A loyal one, as it turned out, because here is where the status flip lands. We imagine ourselves as the protagonists, the ones who showed up and reshaped the world. The mosquito was already reshaping it before we had faces. That is the reversal. We didn't enter the story. We entered its story. Homo sapiens likely encountered mosquito-borne malaria from the very first generation in Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago, meaning malaria has not been a recent complication or a consequence of civilization. It has been a constant companion and killer across the entire existence of our species. Every human who has ever lived has lived inside this trap. Every elder who solemnly blamed bad spirits, every shaman who pointed at cursed grain or an angry sky, not a single one of them named the actual culprit, which was, at that moment, quite possibly landing on their forehead, completely ignored. We flatter ourselves that we are latecomers who eventually figured things out. We did figure things out, eventually, after about 299,800 years of guessing wrong. The ambush was older than memory, older than language, older than the oldest story anyone ever told about why people kept dying. But the question that truly matters is what happened when we stopped wandering and settled down, and how that single decision handed the mosquito something it had never had before, which is exactly where we are going next, into the catastrophic scaling that began the moment we invented farming the enemy. So, here's the obvious objection. Agriculture saved humanity. Full stop. End of story. How could the thing that let us feed millions also be the thing that got millions killed? Here's how. When you clear a forest, flatten a field, and dig channels to carry water to your crops, you are not just growing grain. You are engineering, with tremendous care and effort, the single habitat that Anopheles mosquitoes find most irresistible. Standing water, warm soil, no predators, and a dense crowd of warm bodies sleeping nearby. You have built, entirely by accident, the perfect farm, just not the one you had in mind. This is anthropogenic amplification, the process by which human civilization, in the act of building itself, turbocharges the very enemies trying to tear it down. The genomic evidence makes this concrete and genuinely uncomfortable. A 2021 study analyzing the DNA of Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal variant of the malaria parasite, found that it underwent a dramatic population explosion roughly 10,000 years ago, at almost exactly the moment the first agricultural communities began pooling water and pooling people in the same small patches of earth. The parasite did not evolve some brilliant new trick. It simply took the infrastructure we built and scaled. The elder blames the grain. He is very convincing about it. The mosquito lands on his forehead. Egypt makes this tangible. Archaeological work at the Fayum Depression shows dense human settlement by around 5000 BCE, right at the edge of the Nile Delta marshes, some of the most mosquito-saturated ground in the ancient world. Those communities were not stupid. They were making a rational trade, because the same water that bred the mosquito also irrigated the field that fed their children. Progress and catastrophe arrived in the same bucket. The math probably felt worth it, right up until the fever season. Worth it. What this means for being human is genuinely unsettling. The things we build to survive are often the things that sharpen the blade against us. Farming did not cause malaria, but it handed the parasite a gift: density, water, permanence that 10,000 years of hunting and moving had never provided. The same invention that allowed civilization to exist simultaneously sentenced a staggering portion of it to a slow, shivering death in a reed hut by a canal someone dug last spring to grow wheat. If farming supercharged the parasite like that, what did 10,000 years of that pressure do to the human body itself, which is the question written into our blood? You already know farming handed malaria a perfect feeding ground, but that's not the strange part. The strange part is that malaria hit back so hard, for so long, that it physically rewrote the instructions inside your cells, and the rewrite left scars you might still be carrying right now, today, in your body. Here is why that matters. Evolution does not plan. It just kills the unlucky and lets the survivors breed, which sounds brutal until you realize that somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, over thousands of grinding generations, a random copying error in the hemoglobin gene turned out to be worth keeping. The sickle cell mutation distorts red blood cells into a curved shape that makes it genuinely difficult for Plasmodium to complete its life cycle inside you. Not impossible, but harder. Hard enough, apparently, to matter. In some regions of West and Central Africa, carrier rates for the sickle cell trait reached up to 40% of the entire population, nearly half of everyone, which tells you, with terrible clarity, how many people without it were simply not surviving to have children. That is not a small nudge. That is a species being hammered into a new shape by a parasite the size of nothing. Isn't this just a disease replacing one killer with another, though? Doesn't carrying 2 copies of the sickle cell gene mean you die of sickle cell disease instead? Yes, exactly. And that is the grim arithmetic of what biologists call lethal selection scarring. The mutation protects carriers, but punishes those who inherit it twice. So the population reaches a brutal equilibrium where partial resistance is worth the ongoing cost. You won the lottery and lost it simultaneously. Then there is a second rewrite, arguably cleaner. The Duffy antigen is a protein on the surface of red blood cells that Plasmodium vivax uses as a doorway. In many West African populations, the gene that produces it is simply switched off, at nearly 100% frequency in some groups, meaning vivax malaria knocked on that door for so many thousands of generations that the people who happened to lack the doorknob outlived everyone else until the doorknob was essentially gone from the population entirely. Tusk watches an elder in Burkina Faso solemnly attribute the latest fever season to cursed millet, while a single mosquito lands directly on the elder's forehead and stands there, patient, unbothered, waiting. Your DNA is not just a blueprint for building you. It is a fossil record of every threat real enough to reshape a species, written in the specific places where ancient people died in large numbers before they could pass along anything else. The parasite reshaped our biology at the cellular level, but could it also reshape something larger, like the fate of entire empires on the marsh? Civilizational hemorrhage. That's the mechanism here. The slow, invisible bleeding of a civilization's workforce, its soldiers, its mothers, its grain growers, season after season, long before any enemy reaches the gate. Rome didn't fall to barbarians first. It was being quietly drained, and nobody could see the drain. Around 116 BCE, the Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro was already suspicious enough to write, in his farming manual, that you should avoid swamps because of tiny creatures that cannot be seen, rising from the water and entering you through the mouth and nose. He had no word for Plasmodium. He had no microscope. He was just a careful man watching his neighbors die near standing water and doing the math, which puts him roughly 2,000 years ahead of the official scientific consensus. A little embarrassing for the consensus. Varro was right about the danger, wrong about the mechanism, and completely ignored by the engineers who kept building aqueducts that pooled beautifully near low-lying fields across the Italian peninsula. The mosquito, for her part, didn't care about the engineering awards. The proof isn't just in the texts. Stephanie Marciniak and her colleagues at Penn State University pulled ancient DNA from skeletal remains at the Roman agricultural site of Vagnari and at Lugagnano Val d'Arda, and they found it, malaria, confirmed, running through the bones of people who died across the 1st through 3rd centuries CE. These weren't soldiers killed in battle. They were the population, the unremarkable, necessary, empire-sustaining population, quietly losing. Separately, a 2019 study led by researchers at the Francis Crick Institute found malaria signatures in individuals buried at a 2,000-year-old cemetery near Canossa di Puglia in southern Italy, corroborating what Roman writers You need to slightly increase the infant mortality rate in the farming villages that feed the legions, and then wait 40 years while the legions wonder why they feel thin. An elder near the Pontine marshes blames cursed grain. A mosquito lands on his forehead. He doesn't notice. History isn't made only by armies and emperors. It's made by the invisible logistics of disease moving through a population faster than the population can name it. And if malaria could hollow out Rome, What does the deep ledger of its total kill count across all of history actually look like? Which is exactly the question that drives the half of everyone claim. You're standing at the edge of a mass grave, and nothing here was caused by war. No swords, no siege engines, no emperor's order, just a small insect, roughly 3 millimeters long, doing what it has always done. The question historian Timothy Weingard spent years trying to answer is almost too large to hold. Across the full sweep of human existence, from the earliest Homo sapiens walking out of Africa to everyone alive right now, what single cause has killed the most people? His 2019 answer lands like a quiet catastrophe. The Anopheles mosquito, carrying Plasmodium falciparum malaria in its salivary glands, is estimated to have killed roughly half of all humans who ever lived. Every war you can name, every famine, every plague, stack them, and a 3 millimeter insect may still outweigh the pile. This is what Weingard calls cumulative mortality dominance. Not the deadliest thing in any single century, but the deadliest thing across all of them, compounding silently across hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word about it. It works the way compound interest works, except the currency is bodies and the bank never closes. A 2010 WHO report made the modern echo of this ancient arithmetic concrete. Even now, with bed nets and artemisinin and entire international health agencies dedicated to the problem, malaria kills one child in sub-Saharan Africa approximately every 2 minutes. In the ancient world, with zero medicine, zero understanding of transmission, and zero anything except prayers and guesswork, cumulative mortality dominance ran completely unchecked. A village elder solemnly blames bad spirits for the latest wave of deaths, his voice grave with authority, and a single mosquito drifts across the frame and lands directly on his forehead, entirely ignored by everyone, including him. Here is what makes this genuinely strange. We have built monuments to battles that killed thousands. We have named famines after the years they struck. We have moral frameworks, heroes, villains, and entire genres of art built around human-on-human violence. But the true architect of human mortality operated entirely outside our moral imagination. No malice, no grievance, just a parasite optimizing its own reproduction inside a host that had no idea it was a host. You cannot negotiate with Plasmodium falciparum. You cannot shame it. You can only eventually learn what it actually is, which is why it matters so much that it took until 1897 for anyone to prove what was actually happening. And that story of the 5,000-year lag between dying and understanding why is exactly where we're headed next. So if humans were writing down malaria symptoms in 1550 BCE, why did it take until 1897 for anyone to connect the dots? Fair question. The answer is that knowing something kills you and knowing why it kills you are separated by an abyss, and we spent roughly 5,000 years falling through it. Here is why that gap matters. Every year inside it, people died without a reason that could be acted on. The ancient Egyptian Ebers papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, describes a recurring fever with the kind of clinical precision that should make you nervous. These scribes were not guessing, they were pattern matching across generations of corpses. And yet, DNA pulled from 5,000-year-old human remains in Sardinia, analyzed by researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, confirmed that Plasmodium falciparum was already devastating Bronze Age Mediterranean populations around 3000 BCE, meaning the parasite was busy long before anyone had a word for it, which is honestly the parasite's whole personality. Meanwhile, the tribal elder solemnly attributes the latest wave of deaths to cursed grain, and a single mosquito lands directly on his forehead and sits there, entirely undisturbed. The Roman agricultural writer Columella came heartbreakingly close, warning in the 1st century CE that swamps bred minute creatures which cannot be seen by the eyes, which float in the air and enter the body through the mouth and nose and cause serious diseases. He had the location, the direction, the vibe. He named no insect. That specific miss cost roughly 18 additional centuries. You have to admire the commitment to almost being right. Indigenous Andean peoples had meanwhile found that cinchona bark controlled the fever, and when Jesuit missionaries carried it to Europe around 1630 CE, it became the first effective treatment for malaria, a working cure deployed more than 5,000 years after the disease began killing people at scale, and still without anyone understanding the mechanism. You were treating a fire you could not see with a bucket you could not explain. It worked. This is called progress. Ronald Ross, working in Secunderabad, India, in 1897, finally dissected an Anopheles mosquito and found the parasite inside it, proving the vector, a discovery precise enough to win the 1902 Nobel Prize, the first ever awarded for work on an infectious disease vector. This is what we call diagnostic latency, the gap between the wound and the name of the knife. Knowledge and understanding are not the same thing, and you can live inside a lethal truth for thousands of years and still not see it, which is what makes it so urgent to ask what does it mean for us now, knowing the full arc that a 30-million-year-old ambush, supercharged by our own ingenuity, is still running, which is the whole terrible subject of the enemy we made. But that's not the strange part. Knowing you built the trap is one thing. Living inside it anyway is another entirely. Here is what makes malaria different from every other ancient threat you've inherited. The mammoth didn't need you to thrive. The cave bear didn't need you. The cold didn't need you. But Plasmodium falciparum, the strain that kills most efficiently, needed exactly you. It needed your villages, your rice paddies, your irrigation ditches sitting still in the heat. This is co-evolutionary complicity, and it means the parasite's success story is inseparable from your success story. The two of you rose together. Walk it backward. Around 10,000 years ago, the first farming settlements in West Africa created something the forest mosquito, Anopheles gambiae, had never encountered at scale: permanent shallow water sitting open under warm sun. Entomologist Donald Roberts has shown that gambiae populations in cleared agricultural land run roughly 10 times denser than in intact forest cover. 10 times. You didn't invite the mosquito to dinner. You built the restaurant, hired the staff, and left the door open. Then you clustered. Jericho, one of the earliest walled towns, packed several thousand people into a space where a single infected person could see dozens of new cases inside a single mosquito's 3-week flight radius. Tusk, for what it's worth, notes that the mosquito does not appear impressed by walls. What this means for being human is genuinely uncomfortable. Malaria is not nature punishing you from outside. It is nature responding to you from inside the same feedback loop. Every drainage ditch you dug for a better harvest was a selection pressure on the parasite to find you faster. Every generation of children who survived because they carried the sickle cell trait, and roughly 1 in 4 people in malaria, heavy West African regions carry some version of it today, is evidence that your own genome has been rewritten by a consequence of your own agriculture. You didn't just catch the disease. You participated in designing it. The deepest truth malaria reveals is not that nature is indifferent. It's that you are not separate from nature's feedback loops. Your choices echo back as extinction pressure on yourselves, measured in altered blood, altered cities, altered history. Which leaves one question hanging like smoke over everything that follows. If we are, in every measurable sense, the architects of our own greatest killer, do we finally have enough understanding to become the architects of its end? So go back to that marsh at dusk. Your arm raised, the slap, the reed water cold around your waist, that almost nothing bite already fading from your skin. The child you are carrying doesn't cry. The killer is already inside you both, and you still don't have a word for it. But now you do. Every altered blood cell, every city built wrong beside the wrong water, every generation that blamed the air and never looked at the wing, all of it was a species slowly, painfully, learning to see what was always there. That is the whole story. We were never outmatched by the mosquito's power, only by our own blind spot. So the question that matters now isn't whether we can end this. It's whether, the next time something this small is killing this many people, we'll finally think to look.